Hello, everyone, and welcome to Loeb Leadership's Real Talk. Very excited to have our panel with us today to talk about a topic that I think doesn't get discussed enough, particularly in the workplace, and that's around allyship. And Joy and I recently co-authored an article from allyship to abandoned ship. How do we break the cycle? Because we show throughout history there are these events of promise of equity and equality that either get walked back or completely broken or misstated. And we want to have a deeper, thoughtful conversation around that. But in order to begin, I think it would be great to have a better understanding of what allyship is. And so, Joy, if you could start us off on how you would define effective allyship.
Sure. Allyship is an active support and advocacy for a set or demographic of marginalized people that you are not a part of. For example, since I'm a woman, I cannot be an ally to women. I can advocate, but that doesn't make me an ally. Because I'm Black, I'm not an ally to Black people because self-serving. But if I wanted to support the LGBTQ community, or if I wanted to support the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, I can be an ally to those communities. And that means that if I see an injustice being perpetrated upon that community, I speak up about it. If there's something that's within my power that I can manipulate or influence in order to support that community in the way they're asking for support, then I can do that. And an ally is 24/7, 365 job, but it requires you to have a vested interest in pursuing or supporting the well-being of another demographic.
Thank you, Joy. David Robert, you want to give us your thoughts on allyship?
Yeah, I mean, I always see allyship as standing up for people who are not in the room, right? So, so when no one's looking, are you, calling out injustices, bias? It's easy to do that when you're with somebody who's in a marginalized community who's being sort of criticized or attacked, but it's a little more challenging when you're with people who are like you, who look like you, talk like you, who are engaging in behavior that is discriminatory. It's a little more challenging to call that out, right? So that's how I view allyship.
Thanks. Fritz?
I view allyship as being able to connect to the lived experiences of others and being able to stay there, which takes intentionality, conscious, mindful intentionality. We think about a lot of times people will jump on the allyship train when things are stimulating outside. 2020, there is the protests, all the things that are going on. But as those things went away, a lot of people's energy for it waned. And so a true ally is someone who continues to do the work, that continues to connect to the cause and has empathy for those who are in other groups to keep it going forward.
Thank you, Fritz. And Dr. Burchell?
I think my colleagues covered it really well. I might just underline two things that I believe David and Dr. Fritz mentioned. One is, I think allyship requires self-interrogation continually. And so in what ways does my white identity and whiteness, for example, show up, and how do I manifest that in terms of mindsets and behaviors? And I think the second thing for me is an ongoing focused excavation about how, if we're talking about issues of race and racism, how those things have formed over the course of time and continue to manifest themselves in our organizations and our policies and practices. So we're always learning. To be an ally is to be a learner, and to be kind of personally curious and politically curious and organizationally curious. And I think those are important things.
Thanks, Michael. And I'd like to just share some of my own experience with this, where I was on a panel several years ago and I referred to myself as an ally. And after the panel was over and we had like a little cocktail party, there was a woman from the audience who happened to be a woman of color, and she pulled me aside and she said, "David, can I give you a little feedback?" And I said, "Sure." She goes, I really suggest you not call yourself an ally, but be recognized as an ally, because anybody can call themselves an ally and say, oh, I'm an ally. And that's self-satisfying and self-serving, but they may not be doing the behaviors that allies do. And I thought that was excellent feedback. And I really took it to heart because, what I've learned through my journey in DE&I is that in order to be an effective ally, you have to risk something, that it takes courage. I've been on panels with Joy, and Joy says, just because you march in a rally holding a sign, and then you go home and have a hot meal and get into your warm bed, that doesn't necessarily make you an authentic ally. And to David's point about standing up for people when they're not in the room, when a colleague, a client, a superior says something offensive or biased, across any demographic, not just race, gender, sexual identity, neurodiversity. I think allyship spans many different relationships. But another experience that I've had more than once is when I've been on panels around unconscious bias or racism, and there are white people in the audience, and particularly middle-aged white men like me, as much as that hurts to call myself middle-aged, they will say, David, we want to support, we want to attend events, but as soon as we hear, somebody come out on white privilege or systemic white supremacy or white racism, that's just too uncomfortable, and I withdraw from that. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic of how do we want to, in my opinion, we want to increase the participation of white people, particularly white men, in the allyship discussion. And because that's what's going to bring about change when most leaders and people in positions of authority today are predominantly white men. So, Joy, I'll start with you. How would you respond to that person who came up to me and said, it's tough for me to hear this stuff, so I'd rather not show up?
You know what? I would start with empathy. My entire approach would be one of tough love, but starting with the love. You know what? I get it. I understand. Not having lived this experience and not having had to pay attention to it for the majority of your life, all of this coming at you in a matter of, an avalanche over the last 2-3 years can be overwhelming. It can feel like everybody is trying to kick you out of the club, kick you out of the group. First off, understanding that where that's coming from, and that's a very real place. Cisgender, heterosexual white men over 50 have been the target of a lot of, here's what we need to fix. And if you're coming in as a member of that group and hearing you're the problem, that is going to be disorienting. And I think people who practice DE&I have to be aware of that, because we do need that group with us. But acknowledging, yes, it is hard to hear. Yes, it is not necessarily you. Yes, you want to be here, but then getting into the tough love. I need you to be here anyway. I need you understanding that it's going to be hard to hear, and that some of it may be uncomfortable because some of it may be true even about you. We all have biases. We all have done things that we look back on and say, maybe that wasn't the best way to do it. But I need you to sit with that, digest it, and then come back to the table ready to do the work. Because if you really want to help, you cannot separate the discomfort from the progress. The progress is going to be uncomfortable, and I need you to commit to that so that we can move forward. So it's kind of I hear you, I get it, and I appreciate your particular uncomfortable stance. Can you come with me anyway? And that should give them a different view of it. Like, I think too often people dismiss the frustration, the anxiety, the sense of where do I fit into this that white men feel. If we could acknowledge that and say, we see you, we really see you, we understand that this is uncomfortable, I need you anyway, I think that frames it in a different way.
Thanks, Joy. And David, before I pass it to you, I want to thank our audience again for participating and showing up in all our Real Talks. Please utilize the chat with your questions or reactions to the panel. We love the interaction from our audience. So please don't hesitate to put a question or comment in the chat. David, your reaction to how we bridge this divide?
Yeah, so just to kind of build upon what Joy shared, I mean, I guess my initial reaction is whatever discomfort that a white straight person is feeling when they're being confronted around DE&I pales in comparison to the discomfort that Black people, Hispanic people, gay people have felt for for decades, right? So, like, welcome to the club. So my first reaction. I guess my other reaction is like, I have a hard time getting my head around why white people get freaked out around having a conversation about racism. I have a hard time getting my head around that. It's, you know, again, I've mentioned in previous webinars, you know, there's a Netflix documentary called Who We Are, and then the opening 5 minutes, the gentleman who's actually kind of the narrator of the documentary, he's in an auditorium, and he says, "A show of hands, who in this room ever owned a slave?" He's like, "Of course not. No one raised their hand." He's like, "Slavery was not your problem. It's not, you didn't cause slavery. It's not your problem. But it doesn't mean that we can't engage in a conversation about how we got there, right? And the history of racism and discrimination." And so I guess, you know, I always end those conversations with an open mind. I try to be as empathetic as possible. I try my best to demonstrate authenticity about appreciating that there are people in the room or in the conversation who have a very different lived experience than myself. And I think if we enter those conversations with that mindset, it sort of diminishes or alleviates some of that sort of immediate sort of like defensiveness that we feel. Because once you come into the conversation with your arms up, like, it's going to be really difficult to get to a level of truth and transparency. So I think empathy and appreciation of other people's lived experiences is very important.
I also like to come back because David reminded me of something else. Is actually I'm building on an analogy from The Daily Show. Sorry for the source, but the discussion was around the same topic, and what it amounts to is, you know, nobody alive in the United States right now ever owned a slave, but a lot of your ancestors, friends, business, you know, associates, whatever, built their wealth from that ownership, or built their wealth from the appropriation of ideas, patents, inventions, where women and people of color could not hold patents, could not be on the names of you know, awards or grants or what have you. You benefited from leaving everyone out, and you're still benefiting today. We're not asking you to go back and apologize or feel bad about what happened in the past. We're asking you to acknowledge that it still creates inequity today. And can you recognize that that inequity was created by somebody you had no control over, but you do have control over dismantling the inequity now? So basically, someone else built a platform on top of everybody else and put you at the top. Can you recognize that you're up there and step back and say, let's take the platform out? It doesn't mean that you don't have access to what you had access to before. It means everybody else is getting a chance to be in the spotlight, a chance to be the best that they can be without any oppressive systems holding them back. Can you help us dismantle the system, even though it may have been advantaging you over time? Can you make it fair? That's what it boils down to.
Dr. Fritz, would you like to weigh in?
Wow, some rich stuff here. I love my colleagues are getting into empathy because I'm a psychologist. I love that we do that. Often, this is a kind of conversation we have little practice at having in society without having it get all uncomfortable. Joy, what you just brought up reminds me of what people often feel when they're made aware of the privilege they have because of the past. A little shame, a little guilt, and now we enter trying to have that conversation without much practice and dialogue. So if somebody comes to me and they're telling me they heard something that made them feel a certain kind of way, I too may say, welcome to the uncomfortability. I live it, and a lot of us live it with our own intersectionalities. But then I invite them into a dialogue where we go into, well, what's going on with you? And where's that coming from? And what are you going to do about it? And so a true ally, not a fair weather traveler, but a true ally is going to take that uncomfortability and work with it and keep it moving. They're going to do their own studies. They're going to have this dialogue with me or with whomever, and they're going to keep it going. And so That's what I say to that. So welcome to the struggle.
Thank you, Fritz. And Michael.
I don't know if I could say anything better than what Dr. Fritz just mentioned. Here's what I might add. So I think whiteness demands silence, and I think it's very easy for white people to lean back into their silence. And so to be pulled into the conversation, even when it's uncomfortable, A, is an act of allyship. B, is an act of real dedication to the issue of justice and equality. So, and just by saying whiteness demands silence makes some people very uncomfortable that are maybe on this call, and some people that are, and not uncomfortable at all, right? Like, we're all in different places around how we think about that, but it is what it is. And so I think the issue is, how do we invite people into an extended dialogue? And I love that Fritz actually talked about that, because it's not about debate, it's not about discussion, but it's about dialogue, which is a very different kind of frame in terms of how we engage with each other. And the space that we create in organizations to engage that kind of conversation that really is more dialogic in its texture and its context. And I don't want to get too cerebral about it, but I think that there's a different way of engaging people. And I know we'll get into action items later on, but recently I was working with an organization, a very large organization, and in the analysis around their DEI work, it was a very every single executive was a white guy in their late 50s, early 60s, right? And so they were all very uncomfortable with this issue about kind of racism, and they don't even want to talk about ism, let alone kind of their whiteness and white identity and kind of how they leaned into it, right? But 201, talking with them, 201, every single one was like, I think it's important that we actually have equity. It's really, really important that we actually have diverse voices. I mean, so in some ways, the value system that they're espousing was one thing, even if their mindsets and behaviors may have been something a little bit different. And this is where I think we as leaders who are thinking about allyship need to be able to pull on people's value set and expectations about how they want to be in the world and how they might see themselves in the world, and then begin to have that kind of dialogue that allows them to kind of see and maybe think a little bit differently about how they can lean in, change some of their behaviors so that they can be less silent when it comes to whiteness, for example, or maleness, or. So I'll just add that.
Thank you, Michael. Before we move on, would anybody else like to comment or react to this topic?
No, well said.
Okay.
Feeling that the whiteness demands silence, that's going to show up somewhere else. Thank you.
So David, if I could start off with you on the next question, because it was mentioned that certainly after the murder of George Floyd and other events, there was this palpable movement of action and these grand statements and commitments to equity, to allyship, corporations making these DE&I pronouncements on their websites and putting resources behind it. And even before the movement of overturning affirmative action and a lot of the court cases that we're seeing, even before that came to the spotlight at the Supreme Court, there was this feeling of retreat. And Joy and I write about this, but from your perspective, why do companies and society in general, come out strong, and it turns out to be largely performative? There are companies doubling down today in the face of lawsuits, but many are not. So why do they engage in these patterns? What motivates it?
That's a big question. Well, I mean, so a couple thoughts. So, like, obviously it's June, it's Pride Month, right? And we have a lot of disingenuous, inauthentic allyship with the gay community. Companies will slap a pride flag on their front door on their website. Yeah, we support you, and then they forget about us the other 11 months of the year, right? So part of it is that they never fully intended to be an ally or to make meaningful investments. They just did it because it was like, it was sort of like a little cachet at the moment, right? So and so that's part of it. I think that another reason is that there are cost concerns, probably, right? So if you're a lot of organizations have short-term financial focus, not long-term solvency focus, and so they're more interested in what's happening sort of in the next 6 months to a year and not thinking about 5-10 years out, and therefore DE&I investments kind of slide down the priority list. And quite frankly, it costs money, right? So if you have an organization of 500 people, those 500 people have to be informed, educated, trained, not just once, over time, repeatedly, so they can get on the same page and speak the same sort of language around DE&I. That costs money. And when an organization is making decisions around where they make investments, they may not see that as a priority. There are, obviously, we know there are political pressures. So if you are a publicly funded company, or you are a company that derives any kind of revenue from the government, there are more and more politicians who are aggressively trying to gut DE&I programs. So that's another reason why organizations retreat. I think another reason is that I think there's still a sizable number of a significant number of leaders who still see DE&I as like political correctness and quotas, rather than a long-term strategic initiative to ensure that your organization remains agile and resilient and solvent. And so that's a challenge. And then I think another reason is that you can't underestimate the intense emotional connection that people have to the status quo, and it's change resistant. So because if you are making meaningful investments in DE&I, there's a natural level of disruption in those efforts, and not everyone feels comfortable with disruption and change. And so a natural response is to resist that, right? So, and if that resistance is strong enough, it could actually slow or stall progress being made in the DE&I space.
Someone else like to respond?
I'd jump in and say that organizations and communities move like individuals. Being a psychologist that studies individuals, we move by what motivates us. And what motivates us and that consistently motivates us comes from within. And so when something is happening in the world that triggers us to move and to do things, we're motivated to do it. Like the beginning of the year with that January thing that we're going to go exercise and lose weight, but by February, March, April, it goes away. For people who are the populations we're trying to ally around and help, we get constant reminders that motivate us to stay the course and to do what we got to do to survive. But allies may not get that. Allies may get tired and not get reminded in the same way that a person of color, for example, may get reminded that things haven't changed. So we need to look at our own inner motivations. A lot of performative things are just performative because for a moment I'm motivated because it's the status quo, it's a thing to do. But if you're an ally and you want to stay an ally, you've got to connect what you're doing with something that's going to stay with you. And that's why I said earlier, you've got to be mindfully connected to what's going on with the people around you, whether they're in the room or not. Because if you lose sight of that and you lose the feeling around that, your energy is going to wane.
Thank you, Fritz. Michael or Joy?
Literally was going to talk about New Year's resolutions. So yeah, what Fritz said.
So let's move on to, when people try to be authentic, effective allies, they have the intent, they have a plan, and they intervene if they witness bias, they promote – 'Equitable' practices in their company. in some cases, allies are met with resistance and they're met with skepticism. How would you advise people who want to be true allies, but who keep hitting a wall within their organization? What strategies and practices can they implement in order to be more successful? Who would like to start off with? Joy.
So first and foremost, you have to be a good communicator. If you struggle to get your message across, or if you get frustrated in trying to get somebody to see things your way, you're going to fail no matter what you do. You have to know how to speak in a manner that is something that your audience can absorb. That's first and foremost. After you get your communication methodology down, then you have to be committed to being the odd person out. Because if you are dealing with an organization, or even just a leadership team, or a couple of people that don't want to hear it, want to resist, want to call you names, you're going to have to be able to put on your armor, which hopefully you've been building over time, to withstand that. There's a different form of microaggression that happens to people who are allies, because people will call you social justice warrior, wokeism. What's the other one? There's a lot of names, and I could roll them all the way back several generations. They get cruder and cruder the further back I go. But there's always been a name for someone that other people feel is being a traitor to their kind. You'll hear that from time to time. Be able to withstand that, and to be able to meet that sort of resistance with data, with facts, with understanding, with logic, and with a little bit of pity for someone has to resort to name calling to get their point across. But also remember that you are part of a bigger push, and you're part of a bigger sense of progress. I can't have you, and I'm just speaking like, as a Black woman, so to speak, I can't have you give up because somebody called you a name. I've been getting called names my whole life, to something that David Robert mentioned earlier. I can't have you get tired because it's hard and people are not inviting you to dinner, or they left you off a meeting or whatever. That's been happening to the people that you're trying to ally with their whole lives. I need you to sit with that, understand how it feels, and add that to your motivation as to why you're doing it. Because you don't want people to feel like that. You don't want people to feel ostracized or put out. And you are still in the room where they're making those decisions, where they're having those discussions, and the people you're allied with are not. So I need you to be strong enough to withstand the barbs, the slings and arrows, and keep going. And then understand that this is why you do it, but so that the next generation won't have to do it. So consider yourself part of a bigger group, especially when you start to give out, when you start to get tired, when you start to wonder, why am I doing this? Because it's hard. My uncle's not talking to me anymore, etc. What's your reason? And always reground yourself with the reason you decided to do it in the first place. That's how you hold that commitment.
Thank you, Joy. Michael?
Yeah, I would. I think what Joy said is just absolutely spot on. It just kind of goes back a little bit to what you shared before, David, around about getting some feedback about being an ally. So, I think the best allies are the ones that don't call themselves allies, right? But are named by others as allies. I was reflecting on back when I was, I think a master's student, way many years ago, and we actually had these little buttons that said ally on it, like wear them around campus. And I was like, the most performative social justice way you can actually, like, I get it, and that is an overture to folks. Like, I'm trying to be a safe person, right, for folks, right? And at the same time, I would not suggest that in our organizations we run around and say, hey, I'm an ally. But to, as Joy mentioned, to manage your communication skills, to be curious, inquisitive, have your messaging, right? And also, if I'm speaking to kind of my white friends or my white male friends, to be humble enough to ask for support and help. Did I show up in the right way? How else might I need to have shown up for you, right? And get feedback. So because sometimes we think we're doing the right thing right, and we're not. The help that doesn't help. So to be as open as possible to sending messages, but then also being receptive to feedback and acting on feedback. And that's an important piece of being an ally as well.
I guess I would add something there, Michael. So, I mean, I guess I would ask if I was the recipient of pushback on being an ally, as an example, I guess I would ask the person, like, what's triggering you? Like, where's this coming from? Like, what's the problem here? Like, I mean, I've had this conversation before with people, and sometimes, you know, I think people, first of all, people should stop engaging in social media and watching the news, because, you know, it's just programmed to make us hate each other. Because I've had a conversation with somebody in my my social network who really thinks that allyship is this sort of like far left progressive initiative, right? And it's a huge turnoff. And it's like, no, not really. To me, it's not a political position, right? It's a human position to take, right? It's a gesture of kindness. That, you know, I care enough about the people that I'm working with, or who I'm associating with, or who are part of my community, to understand their lived experience, empathize with them, because at the end of the day, we have more in common than we have differences, right? And but I think that we are becoming programmed to hyper focus on what differentiates us rather than what brings us together, right? So that's what I would do. I would confront the person or people and say, like, what's triggering you to make you upset that I'm supporting somebody who's not like you? It's again, it's hard for me to get my head around why someone would have a problem with that, right? So, but again, I mean, just generally speaking, in our culture, in our country, we're so politically polarized, and there's so much sort of tension that I think we're taking our sight off of what's most important, right? Which is what binds us together as humans, as Americans, and let's focus on that rather than being forced to focus on the things that actually differentiate us. So that's what I would do. I would just be very bold and say, like, what's going on with you?
Fritz?
Along those lines, and I would soften the word from confront to invite into dialogue, which is another way of confronting the reality. When someone throws up a wall, when someone pushes back, if we confront that reality by going, wow, can you tell me more? What's going on with you? Can you tell me more about what's coming on for you? Can you define what's going on a little bit better? If you can invite them into dialogue, you can find out a little bit more about what's going on with them. I mean, as a therapist, this is what you do constantly. You're constantly receiving a person's, air quotes, resistance, and you're inviting them to explore it. And quite often, what people end up showing are primal instincts of anxiety and fear, and a reaction based upon lived experiences. And if you get them telling the narrative of what's going on with them, when they start to tell you that story, you may start to have a different understanding of where they're coming from in the moment. And as they articulate that narrative, some light bulbs might be going off for them. I mean, that is the goal when I'm working with people individually. But we need to become a culture that is not afraid of that kind of pushback or resistance, and really practice. If there's one thing you got to get good at, is getting good at just, okay, noticing it, and then inviting a dialogue where you can find out more about the other person. In order for us to, if we have the intention of influencing or changing the hearts and minds of someone else, they first have to see and feel that we have seen them and connected to them if they're going to make any movement in any direction.
I think that's a great point, Fritz. And I've heard you facilitate dialogue groups before, and facilitate where, you know, somebody in the moment, or maybe with, you know, without the intent, but says something offensive or uncomfortable for people, and instead of bringing a sledgehammer,
Ooh, that's interesting.
You call time out and say, hey, we have a great learning opportunity here right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's just so disarming, and kind of keeps the temperature in the room moderate to have that dialogue before people, you know, get that amygdala gland fired up and they get into survival mode, and then it's less likely to be productive. So, you know, we've talked a lot about having that empathy, having that grace for people, giving the benefit of the doubt. But if people are interested in being authentic allies, how would you suggest they go about educating themselves on the current issues of the day for underrepresented communities?
Can
Fred?
I jump back in and start with, if you want to do this work is hard and those uncomfortabilities are hard. So all of the people on this panel are people I call and have talked to and have received support from in doing this work. So if you're an ally and you want to stay an ally, you need to be in close contact with other people that are doing the work and getting feedback from them. And sometimes just having their shoulder to lean on as you're expressing your own frustration and disbelief as the way things are going in the world. So a lot of the learning comes from these lived experiences in these spaces. And if you're on this webinar right now and you're watching us, these are the sorts of things that you should be going to as often as you can. I mean, the current state of being able to go on the internet and be part of these discussions is ever available to us. So I do want to inspire people to keep on putting yourself in contact with people that are doing the work. Learn, keep reading, keep showing up, and when it hurts, and it will hurt, and if it doesn't hurt, then you're doing something wrong, because that's part of this. Talk to other people and let them know what you're going through and get their feedback and words of wisdom.
Who else would like to add to that?
I mean, I would add to that. So, I mean, it goes back to the article that you and Joy wrote, DB, right? So I would imagine that, a majority of Americans probably have no clue about the history of broken promises. So I thought it was a really important article. It was eye-opening for me as well. Again, I mentioned social media and sort of, general news programs. Don't rely on those sources to educate yourself, right? Like, take a proactive role on seeking out information to get an accurate, education and accurate information, rather than relying on somebody else who's politically motivated to sort of like feed you information that kind of fits their narrative. I guess I've always been a very intellectually and socially curious person. I tend to gravitate towards people who are not like me. It energizes me, and it's fulfilling. So, surrounding yourself or making connections with people who are completely unlike you helps a lot as well. Because the more time you spend with those people, the more insight you get into their lived experience. And I have friends of across the spectrum, and when we're together, you can see how the public treats them, and and it's eye-opening in terms of what their sort of like common lived experience is. And I think just increases your level of empathy and understanding, which I think allows you to make more informed decisions. I think that sort of innate curiosity is really important as well.
Joy?
I'm going to come with a really, really weird reference. Stick with me. There was a movie that came out maybe in the late 80s called Soul Man. And it starred this white guy who took some kind of medicine pill or whatever to turn his skin brown so he could get into college on a minority scholarship. That's not the point. The point is he was actually able to live the life of a Black man for like a whole semester. And a lot of things that he used to let slide, he realized they're talking about me. Even though he's still, internally, he's still the white guy that he was, he's seen and treated as a Black guy everywhere he went. When you talk about immersive experience, he's also befriending Black people. He's talking to other Black people about their experience. They're speaking to him as if he's been through it too, because he looks like he should have, right? And he's learning about another culture in a way that he never could have without that medical pill or what have you. He reverts back at the end of the movie, but he reverts back as a full-blown ally because he knows he has developed empathy by truly experiencing it. I am not asking you all to go take some kind of Black pill. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is you also, with the advent of the internet for good purposes, documentaries, exposés, really good podcasts that are recommended to you by somebody who has listened to it and says this is a good one to listen to. books. There are so many books that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years around each type of the marginalized community. There's books about the history of women in this country, books about the history of the struggles of Native Americans, of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, specifically around specific events. There's books about the Jewish struggle. There's books about the well-documented history of the LGBTQ struggle in the United States. You need to understand what people have gone through so you can understand why they are requesting your support in this way, in this moment, and then listen to them. But if you just, you watch some Hollywood TV show and think, oh, I know all about it, or you don't have any firsthand experience because you're not talking to the people in that group, you're only getting an academic resource or talking to somebody who knows somebody who said they saw somebody do something, that's not good information. So make sure that you are absorbing things that are giving you an unfettered truth about whatever it is you're researching. And do the research. Don't expect your one gay friend or your one Black friend or your one Latino friend to tell you everything about their community, because the community itself is not a monolith. I can't tell you everything there is to know about being a woman. I can't tell you everything there is to know about being Black, because we all show up in different ways. I can give you a facet of it, and then I can ask you to read this book, check out Audre Lorde, read bell hooks, etc., and get more information. Dr. Joy Degree is one of my favorite people. There's a set of scholars in every denomination. It takes a lot of time to read all that stuff, but I mean, you got through 4 years of college, didn't you? So read some more and be aware of what's happening, and then stay current. And that means politically current, socially current, globally current as well. So stay tapped in once you get that foundation of knowledge. Okay, I'm gonna be quiet.
Michael, anything you want to add as to resources or where people can go to find?
Check LinkedIn. There's actually a lot of resources on LinkedIn.
Mhm.
Probably a lot of resources in whatever industry your organization sits. There are industry associations, industry groups. Connect, get engaged, find out what the materials are, what the resources are. Be a little bit skeptical, right? There's enough stuff on social media right now and enough kind of generated content which is not completely accurate. So look for veracity, but it's there, and you really have to work hard to not see it. If you're paying attention, you'll see it. Go after it, pull on it, examine it, ask about it, interrogate it, connect with others. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. I just want to react to something Joy said also about, no one's a monolith within any community. But particularly in companies and organizations that don't have representation, quite often they keep going to the person from the underrepresented community to either represent on behalf of the company or to ask all the questions. And what I've heard from people I've had this discussion with, it's exhausting.
Mhm.
Why do I have to do this all the time? And I know within law firms, when they hire people of color, they expect them to go to all the events around diversity, equity, inclusion, while white partners are going to business development meetings or continuing legal education or get to go home, as opposed to having that shared commitment to doing these things and raising awareness. So again, as we have about 15 minutes left, so if anybody in the audience, questions, comments, greatly welcomed and appreciated. So moving on.
Hold on.
Go ahead, Michael.
Add one little thing, and it's important for those of us who are kind of on the call, who are in organizations doing this work or supporting leaders who are doing this work. You just mentioned something very important, and that is that oftentimes folks from underrepresented groups are the ones who are kind of called on, right, to kind of educate, help, be that resource. And quite often that is unpaid for and unaccounted work. And so get recognized when promotion times comes around. And as an ally, for those of you who are on the phone or on this call who see yourselves as allies, really great ally behaviors is making sure that you advocate and stand up for those folks who doing this work on behalf of the organization where it may not get recognized and may not be part of your performance review, but is really, really important. That would be an example of good ally behavior. So I just wanted to highlight that and raise that up because you noted it a second ago.
This actually came up a couple of years ago. We were having a panel discussion, and there was a Black female partner at a law firm in New York City, and she raised this very issue that, she was called on to kind of spearhead a lot of the external marketing around trying to recruit other Black associates and all the diversity, equity, inclusion events and stuff. And it took away time from her billable hours and her business development. And so when it came time for reviews, she was penalized for that work. So, because when you compared her billable hours compared to her colleagues, she was quote unquote underperforming. And the issue that she had was that nobody came to her rescue and said, well, wait a second, there's a reason why she's not on the same level as her colleagues, because we're asking her to do like 8 other things, that have nothing to do with business development. So, it's a real issue.
Just in the time we have left, because I think it's really important area to end on, in light of the Students for Fair Admissions decision, overturning affirmative action, recent decision out of Georgia with a private fund giving grants to businesses owned by Black women, and that being held to be harmful to white people, when there are venture funds and private equity funds that lend and invest in almost exclusively white-owned businesses, but that didn't hit the decision of this circuit court panel. And also, in certain states, you can't say the words diversity, equity, inclusion in educational institutions. What can companies, organizations, firms do? And like I said earlier, many are doubling down in this environment of threat and litigation. What can they do to advance equity and inclusion in the workplace under the current climate and restrictions? And some of them are state by state.
So I can jump in quickly. So how do I phrase this? So companies don't take positions, people take positions, right? So companies are not living, breathing organisms, people are, right? So, and so, what I would say is that you may not, and when I'm training on culture work, I say this all the time, that you may not be in a position that has complete control or authority over driving enterprise or firm-wide initiatives, right? Because inclusion is culture work, right? It's the same thing, right? So they're interchangeable. And so, but you do have complete control over how you as an individual shows up. And so your company's senior leaders might take a position that they're not willing to make significant investments in DE&I, but you can still make a significant investment in DE&I. You can still show up in an inclusive way. You can still demonstrate empathy. You can demonstrate, cultural curiosity. Like, you have complete control over that, and your company can't prevent you from doing that, right? So again, I always say management is a fact, leadership is a choice. So every day when you show up to work, you are in complete control over the decisions you make, how you delegate work, how you communicate, how you give feedback, how you connect with your colleagues. And so that's where I would start, because imagine what's possible that, if I do that more often than not, and then my colleague does that, and another colleague, and over time you have the tipping point, right? You have a vast majority of the people in your organization who are showing up in those high trust, inclusive ways, and that inevitably is going to shift the culture. So you don't necessarily need senior leaders. It's easier, but you don't necessarily need senior leaders to be completely bought in. You have control over how you show up, and that is infectious. And over time, more and more of your colleagues will mirror that behavior. And then you get to a point where, again, the tipping point where that becomes sort of the standard and the norm, which is then creates the fabric of your culture.
So I'll jump in real fast so that we can finish on a high note with my friends, colleague, and Fritz and Joy. So I just want to jump off of what David just said, because I think here's the thing: diversity is destiny. right? We live in a VUCA world, and it's even becoming more and more so. And so the degree that we actually are paying
And Michael, can you just define VUCA for people who aren't
so,
familiar
well,
with that?
it kind of it is uncertain, right? It is variable, it's ambiguous, right? It's complex. Like those things are kind of like part of our world that are just increasing. And so so economies are changing, the world is changing around us, and we have seen moments like this in our history in the US before, with this kind of anti-wokeism and that kind of stuff. This is not new. It is not new, and it will, but as Dr. King would say, the arc is long and it bends towards justice. And so we continue to increase, right, in terms of our ability to attend to these issues. I would say that that in terms of really kind of the role of all of us who are on the call. So if you're if you're dialing in and you're kind of listening to this, leaders behave in certain ways that shape the employee experience, right? That experience is what drives culture, or what makes up culture. And the culture is what drives performance. And so if you want to have an organization down the road that is successful, that is thriving, that is able to be agile in this kind of VUCA world, right? Then you have to pay attention to how the leaders are leading, what practices and behaviors they're engaged in, and what are the mindsets. And so therefore, I think that in some ways, this issue around kind of diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, all those things are kind of practices that leaders have to lead around. And I think there's a lot of pushback from a lot of organizations around kind of being woke or whatever that thing is. But at the end of the day, being good allies, being good leaders means that you have a for all approach, right? That you actually are thinking about everybody in your organization, not just some people. That you're ensuring that you're developing everyone in your organization, not just some people. And so I think having that mindset and frame as a leader is what will drive the experience of your employees, that will shape the culture. And that's what we want to anchor on. So I'm kind of now toss over to my cool friends, Fritz and Joy, to bring us home.
Should probably stop there, but I'm going to say what I want to say anyway. So for everyone that is worried, I'm worried as well on the way things are going from a political standpoint, with the over polarization of everything that should just be human dignity. Why are we going red and blue about this stuff when it's like, do you want children that are healthy or not? That shouldn't be a political statement. That being said, for people that think, well, this is going this way, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to backslide on all of the progress because I feel like it's going to benefit me. Think that if you want to. And I say that with all the animosity in my heart, because that genie, that horse that left the barn, genie's out of the bottle, whatever you want to call it. One of the biggest things that has come up recently is this idea that we don't want to promote someone based on race. Okay, we never asked you to do that. We asked you to promote the best person possible. And if you take the names off the resumes and anything that indicates race off the resumes, we were asking you for that anyway. Go ahead and do it. And you might be surprised who ends up getting the promotion, because all of this desire to remove any indication of specifically of race is based on the erroneous assumption that people of color are not qualified. Go ahead and take the names off if you want to. Make it all, mix it all up, and then pull out the best person, and you'll be surprised how often it is not who you thought it was going to be. And so we'll lean into it if you want to. Yeah, let's take it all off. Let's make sure everyone doesn't know who's up for promotion and pick the candidate based on the qualifications. And that is actually one of the goals of inclusion in the first place, is to pick the most qualified people. The problem is a lot of folks that are trying to squash affirmative action don't realize qualified people come in all colors, shapes, and sizes. And so I think ultimately, like they said, that arc bends towards justice. Ultimately, they'll realize that ain't what they wanted in the first place. And then you're going to have to come out and say, well, we just don't want any gay people. We just don't want any black people. We just don't want any women. Now, nobody wants to work with you, because the younger generations, like 35 and under, have grown up in a world where, what do you mean? What do you mean you don't want anybody? What do you mean you don't want to be inclusive? I've been inclusive my entire life. My whole best friend circle is, Rainbow Coalition. What are you saying? So trying to resist this is ultimately going to put you on the wrong side of history in the long run, but it's going to hurt you in the short run, because where are you going to get your talent from? How are you going to compete? How are you going to stop attrition when you're doing all the things to alienate, discourage, and turn off the very people that you need in the pipeline to make sure your business moves forward? So that is my that's my two cents. I'm ending on the down note, and I will let Fritz pull y'all out of that. Go, Fritz.
I will. And as I listen to you, Joy, I'm reminded how I'm listening to and processing intellectually what you're talking about, but you have a way of letting it hit my soul. And I think that is the way that we need you to do the work. If you're on this, if you're in this webinar and you've been listening to what we're talking about, a lot of what we're talking about sits up there in the neocortex. But if you really want to do the long-term work, you have to allow it to churn inside of you, and you have to feel it. And one of the ways you can feel it often is by listening to the narratives and the experiences of other people. And don't just let it hit the front of your brain, let it seep inside of you. Some of the best things I've ever read that really connected me to groups outside of myself, groups, the Jewish population, I've read about exactly what was happening during the Holocaust and the real human stories. I could have wept for a group I've never met by just reading those stories. That's why we need each other to be communicating. We need to build high trust, highly connected people that are in constant narrative with one another. And when you do that, when I've spoken to people who are way on the other side of the political fence, and they started talking about some of the primal feelings that they're feeling, well, that resonates. That makes sense. Their ultimate decision makes no sense to me, but usually the primal things that move them, anxiety or fear or worry about their kids or their future, oh, that makes a whole lot of sense. And that's how we need to take in this kind of material. You've got to listen, and let it touch us.
We also have to we also have to take responsibility and think for ourselves, right? So, I was talking to DB yesterday about this, or the day before. Like, so I have a friend of mine who thinks that DE&I is a bunch of baloney, right? And he just rolls his eye, when I talk about it. And so the other day we were assembling a trivia team because we were entering a trivia competition. And so you can't make this up. The irony is like unbelievable. He's like, well, we need like variation of expertise. We need somebody in the team who knows geography. We need somebody in the team who knows science, somebody who knows population, somebody who knows, history. And I go, oh, wait, so you do believe that diversity is a winning strategy? And he's just like, look at me, his head's going to explode. And so I think that, I think we are too easily influenced by
talking heads
who have an agenda, who want us to believe a certain thing, right? And they want us to think that diversity, equity, inclusion is a something that's nefarious, something that's sort of a hidden agenda, and it's not. Again, it's a human position, right? It's about being a kind, authentic, colleague, or a kind, authentic community member. There's nothing nefarious or hidden about diversity, equity, inclusion. So I was laughing about this because my friend Rob was like, oh yeah, I've never thought about it that way.
And David, if I could just add, because we talk about people being motivated by their wallet, and the biggest consulting firms and some of the top, most business schools, and the Great Place to Work, the CEO Michael Bush talks about this, that from 1960 to 2010, it was the greatest growth of diversity in the US economy, in management and leadership. We went from $500 billion economy to well over $10-12 trillion. And diversity played a big role in that. And study after study shows that the most diverse teams are the most productive, efficient, collaborative, innovative. So that's where I get confused about what is really getting in the way here. And so I see we're up on time. I want to greatly thank our panel, thank our audience for participating. It's always a pleasure. And we look forward to seeing you next time. And please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn, email, go to loebleadership.com. You can check out resources under blog. You can find the article Joy and I wrote, From Allyship to Abandonship, How Do We Break the Cycle? And thank you so much for being here.